Hi, welcome to our video. My name is Timothy Patterson. I'm assistant professor at Temple University. I'll be presenting alongside of my colleagues Insa Khan, who's associate professor at Temple University, and Lori Esposito, who's a doctoral candidate in literacy and learners at Temple University. And we're going to be talking about our article published in Theory and Research in Social Education, titled Virtual Reality for Promoting Historical Empathy, a Mixed Methods Analysis. So we're interested in the potentials of virtual reality, or VR, henceforth in this presentation, as a potential tool for increasing learners' presence and positive emotions, and for nurturing historical learning both in and out of the classroom. The use of VR head-mounted displays, or HDMs, henceforth, enables interaction with virtual spaces using 3D inertial sensors that track and monitor head movements so that objects can be displayed in the user's gaze in an immersive VR environment. Because of the potential power of user immersion into digitally reconstructed past worlds through VR, scholars have suggested it can enhance learners' historical empathy and interest in historical content in both museum exhibits and social studies lessons. Despite reasonable optimism about the use of VR in cultivating historical empathy in various educational venues, little empirical research has explored the use of this emerging tool in history education contexts. In this study, we define historical empathy using the definition that Endicott and Brooks developed in their 2013 article, quote, as understanding how people from the past thought, felt, made decisions, acted, and faced consequences within specific historical and social contexts. Studies related to historical empathy and various other tools and technologies in social studies education suggest that multimedia presentations and immersive perspective-taking tasks, both learning experiences like those that occur while using VR, can be pathways towards meeting the elusive goal of developing historical empathies in learners. However, very few empirical research has directly examined historical empathy and virtual reality. So to examine these potentials more directly, this article explores the utility of immersive VR in fostering historical empathy with adult learners. Using a mixed methods analysis, we gauge participants' historical empathy and situational interest, defined in this study as an affective response evoked by the situation at hand after experiencing VR content through either HDMs or flat-screen devices. The results offer practitioners some optimism about the efficacy of VR as an instructional tool. We conclude that immersive VR does indeed hold the potential to develop in adults both historical empathy and situational interest in history, though the type of task wherein participants express historical empathy appears instrumental as well. This study is of particular value to museum educators, public historians, and teacher educators as they consider utilizing current technologies to engage adult audiences more fully in historical content.
Hi, I'm Lori Esposito, and I'm going to talk briefly about prior research that has informed and inspired our work. Now, a small body of studies has explored the use of virtual reality for history learning, but these studies did not focus on the development of historical empathy specifically. However, a variety of low-tech approaches have been used in the past to promote historical empathy. These include having students read primary source documents, using a combination of visual and textual evidence with students, asking questions that focus on students' perspectives, and promoting reflection by students. Other studies have investigated the use of film and even the impact of museum exhibitions. Also, importantly, writing tasks have been used. Results of those studies suggest that writing can serve as a powerful means through which learners assume a perspective that in turn helps them develop empathy. Now, all that being said, our work also explores the concept of situational interest. Researchers have theorized that situational interest, which is temporary and tied to a specific context or task, can lead to more enduring personal interest. It has also been theorized that personal interest in turn may lead to civic engagement and may support historical empathy. In our work, we respond to a gap in the existing research by exploring whether the degree of VR immersion affects the development of historical empathy and situational interest in adult learners, as well as how this outcome may be supported by a writing task requiring perspective taking. Now I'm going to talk very briefly about the concept of historical empathy in particular. There's considerable scholarly debate over what historical empathy is and the extent to which learners can actually attain it. It's believed that historical empathy is an essential tool that historians use when doing their research, and that it can lead to rich interpretations of the past. Other scholars have argued, and we agree with them, that promoting historical empathy can help learners engage with civic issues and can encourage pro-social democratic participation. Scholars have also debated whether historical empathy is a process or an outcome. We believe it's both. In fact, we think of historical empathy as an outcome within a process. We see an intervention, such as the use of immersive VR to learn about a history topic, as a moment in the process of moving toward historical empathy. Scholars have also long debated to what extent learners should be encouraged to draw from their own emotions when considering the perspectives of past people. Some scholars have argued that historical empathy should be a purely cognitive exercise. However, we agree with other scholars who have argued that historical empathy should also have an affective component, as well as with scholars who argue that learners need to use their imaginations in order to engage in perspective taking. We take particular inspiration from the work of Endicott and Brooks, who suggest three components to historical empathy. The first being knowledge of historical context and the differences between the time period being studied and the present. The second being perspective taking. And the third being an understanding of the emotional responses of past persons based on one's own responses to their own life events. So, like Endicott and Brooks, we believe that learners need to use knowledge of the historical context and their own affective or emotional responses to similar situations in the present to identify what historical persons were likely feeling.
Based on the review of previous literature, we developed two research questions. First, what is the effect of VR type and a perspective-taking writing task on adults' development of historical empathy? And second, do VR learning and writing tasks aimed at cultivating historical empathy develop adults' situational interest towards historical content? To investigate these two questions, we recruited 37 undergrad and grad students who voluntarily participated in the study. One case was eliminated due to technical glitches during participation, and the data from 36 participants were included in the final analysis. In exploring participants' situational interest in historical empathy, we applied a 2x2 factorial design to investigate the effect of VR movie types and prompt types on participants' historical empathy and situational interest. By adopting a convergent parallel mixed method design, we collected quantitative survey data to gauge participants' situational interest and qualitative data through their writing task for evidence of historical empathy. The entire intervention took approximately 40 to 45 minutes. We began by introducing participants to the historical event, the Children's Immigration Project, by having participants read a short introductory text about the project. The investigation phase of the intervention provided participants with additional historical context and helped them make effective connections with historical characters in the movie. We used a VR movie, Defying the Nazis, to provide an immersive learning experience. During an approximately 5-minute viewing, Participants experienced the voyage as if they were in the boat with child refugees with their 360-degree computer-generated visuals. Although all participants watched the same VR movie, they were randomly assigned to either a flat screen or a head-mounted VR device. After watching the movie, participants were asked to retell the story from either a first-person perspective or through factual recount of the children's immigration project. Through random assignments, the first-person writing group was given the prompt starting, "Imagine you were in the boat," and the prompt for factual recount started, "Describe what happened during the children's immigration project." Then we coded these writing samples based on the scheme used by Dulure and colleagues to assess participants' level of historical empathy. They defined historical empathy as a construct pertaining to historical contextualization, affective connection, and historical perspective taking. Based on these three constructs, they further identify subcategories as you can see in this screen, and we adapted these codes to fit our operationalization of historical empathy in order to produce a historical empathy score. We also used the situational interest questionnaire to assess participants' affective responses. The 12-item questionnaire asked how much participants perceived the task to be enjoyable or engaging, as well as important or valuable, with three subconstructs: trigger situational interest, and maintained situational interest related feeling, and maintained situational interest related to value.
Our findings offer insights into participants' interest in history following a VR intervention, as well as the historical empathy evidenced at the end of this instructional arc. Broadly, our analysis of the writing samples suggests learning through immersive VR can help foster historical empathy, though these participants' scores were only marginally higher than the scores of those who completed the activities through VR. On the other hand, participants who completed the first-person writing prompt evidence overwhelmingly higher historical empathy scores than those that wrote factual recall narratives. In addition, the VR intervention was effective in grabbing participants' attention and thus helped them develop situational interest in the historical content of the lesson. So, as I mentioned, participants who experienced learning through immersive VR demonstrated slightly higher historical empathy scores in their writing samples than those who experienced learning through VR on the flat screen. So you can see these scores in the table on the screen. With regard to particular elements of historical empathy, participants who experienced immersive VR evidenced a smaller affective connection with the historical figures in the film that they experienced than the participants who experienced the lesson through a flat screen. However, the immersive group scored higher on their use of historical content from the film and incorporated more additional content knowledge about the Holocaust and the Third Reich. The immersive VR group also showed greater evidence of perspective taking following the instructional exercise. However, these differences are not entirely significant. Even with relatively similar scores, there were some qualitative differences across VR type. For instance, we observed more vivid displays of emotion and imaginative retellings of scenes from the IVR group, the immersive VR group, than the flat screen group, even when they both wrote from the first person perspective. And we'll let you take a look at the article if you want to explore some of those writing samples. Participants who completed the first-person writing prompt overwhelmingly elicited higher historical empathy scores than those who completed the factual recount writing prompt. We observed no difference in use of historical information from the lesson across writing prompts. Not surprisingly, participants who wrote their responses in the first person made more affective expressions and demonstrated more perspective taking than those who wrote factual accounts of the children's immigration project. The affective connections and attempt at perspective taking in the first person sample typify the qualities that produce the higher overall historical empathy score in the first-person writing group. However, there is even evidence of some level of historical empathy regardless of whether participants wrote a writing sample from a first-person perspective or wrote a factual recount. In other words, while the first-person prompt was more likely to elicit higher historical empathy scores, evidence of historical empathy was present across the data set. When limiting our analysis to samples written in the first person, participants in the immersive condition had the higher of the two scores, as evidenced in this table here. Participants writing a factual recount in the flat screen group scored slightly higher than those who wrote a factual recount in the immersive group. The difference in scores is owed to one element of historical empathy: acknowledgement of the emotions of a historical actor. Otherwise, participants in the immersive group demonstrated higher scores than those in the flat screen group across all other elements. This indicates that participants experiencing the immersive condition either avoided acknowledging emotions or did not bring their own emotions into the writing samples. Still, the historical empathy scores for factual recount samples in both groups were significantly lower than the scores for first-person responses in both groups. Only participants writing the factual recount used incorrect information and offered no emotions in their writing samples. This suggests that immersive VR does hold some potential to cultivate historical empathy, though a larger sample size is needed to establish this finding with more confidence. And if you'd like to take a look at the article, we offer some examples from the writing samples to illustrate the various aspects of historical empathy that were at work across both writing samples. There was some evidence of presentism, and we noticed instances of participants marshaling historical imagination to make sense of or to respond to the various writing prompts. Finally, to examine whether the VR experience helped participants develop situational interest towards the Children's Immigration Project, we asked participants to complete the situational interest questionnaire after they completed the instructional arc. According to the descriptive statistics, the participants' mean score was 59 out of 72, about 82% of the total possible score for overall situational interest. While this score suggests high situational interest among participants, scores for the three sub-constructs showed variations among types of situational interest. Broadly, we found that VR historical learning was effective in triggering participants' immediate responses towards the topic as engaging. Our findings suggest that immersive VR may play a part in fostering historical learning in adults. Given the amount of historical empathy evidenced in our participants' writing samples, what our findings do allow us to argue is that a combination of direct instruction, primary source documents, engagement with media, be it immersive VR or flat screen video viewing, and a writing prompt does appear to inspire historical empathy. Consistent with previous studies that found positive affective states provoked by using VR, the VR history learning experiences provided in this study also appeared to grab participants' attention and foster their interest in historical content. Considering that highly immersive VR helps to develop longer-lasting attitudes in the intention to engage in pro-social behaviors, we argue that VR history learning could potentially help adults to appreciate the value of history and engage in civic issues. This also supports earlier assertions around the efficacy of historical movies and documentaries in fostering historical empathy when appropriately scaffolded, and brings VR into a larger conversation about what resources educators might use to inspire historical empathy. The prompt that motivates participants' thinking seems to be the highest factor in the levels of historical empathy evidenced by the participants in our study. That a first-person perspective response would prompt empathetic responses is not surprising. That factual recall prompts also inspired historical empathy, albeit less, is cause for cautious optimism for the use of VR in historical education. To conclude, we are optimistic about the potentials of VR, but our findings compel us to highlight additional pedagogical considerations around its use in history education, including the incorporation of VR into constructivist approaches in inquiry-based instruction and blended learning. Unlike other technologies, VR cannot easily substitute for traditional teaching methods, and integrating it into their lessons may encourage teachers to reconceptualize their social studies instruction altogether. In addition, most activity performed through VR is likely to involve performing or witnessing acts within a sensory environment that evokes presence in past places and time periods, potentially more akin to participating in a historical reenactment than doing the work of historians. Perspective taking and affective connections may be possible through VR, but without further scaffolding, historical contextualization is unlikely. In sum, the novelty of VR should not displace pedagogical judgment, and we urge educators to scaffold VR experiences for meaningful learning. We also encourage educators to help learners think critically about the limitations and biases of VR content, and to evaluate the technology's usefulness to their learning. Learners should be aware that VR experiences provide a singular perspective, and that even in self-guided sessions, options are controlled by the developer. This understanding can be solidified by asking learners to create their own VR products to both demonstrate and deepen their thinking about historical topics. Thank you for watching our video. Please reach out with any questions.